Welcome back for more AP Biology. Today we're going to be continuing the talk of what goes on with action potentials and how we can put that all together into making the brain. So we're going to look at the evolutionary patterns that turn out to result in what we call a brain, or cephalization. And again, there's lots of things that show up here, lots of text references. So from last time I pointed out that if we get large aggregates of cells talking to one cell and you need to take all those inputs, synthesize them together to get an output, we can call that a brain, because that's what goes on in our heads, but plants can do the same thing. Any organism can pull this trick off. So whenever we have that happen, again, what we have to have is we get lots of input. So some of them are going to say depolarize, some of them will say don't depolarize. So we're going to get conflicting sets of actions, and then there's a processing that occurs that results in a response. The catch is it probably won't be, a couple of cells to one. You'll have hundreds into one, which will lead to hundreds into another cell, which will lead into hundreds of inputs into another cell. So the cell that's sending out a signal is going to be one of hundreds inputting into something else, even though that one cell received hundreds of inputs. What does this turn out to be? It's a massive computer system. It's a massive series of ones and zeros, and how do we make sense of this? And we call that, making sense, a brain. The reflex arc is just the way that we can simplify it all. You put in an input, you process it, you spit out a response. That's the big version, but that doesn't tell you about what the brain is. The brain turns out to be a massive series of these reflexes. But what triggers all this stuff? We call those sense receptors, or senses. And if we look at us, animals, we happen to have a few senses. So we can see things, we can feel things, so we can deal with pressure, we can taste things, which is dealing with chemistry, we can smell things, which is dealing with chemistry, we're sensitive to light, we're sensitive to heat. But we also turn out to be sensitive to gravity. Some animals are sensitive to electromagnetism, so like charges or magnetic fields. If we look at plants, they're sensitive to a whole bunch of other phenomena, such as types of light that we aren't receptive to. All of those things are what we would call senses, which will trigger action potentials. They're inputs into signaling pathways. And if I look at organisms, namely looking at animals, the way that we process all of that information shows up in basically two versions. We had one version that doesn't seem to have a centralized set of all of those sense receptors, and we call those organisms that don't have a central nervous system. So cnidarians like the hydra, or echinoderms like the sea star. Or we could have organisms where everything gets focused into a spot, into one region. We call that region a brain, and that would be everything else. So insects, us, whole bunches of worms, blah, 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 blah. Mollusks, whatever. Those things turn out to have localizations of a lot of senses into one spot. Because if you think about it, for us, the rest of your body basically deals with heat and pressure. That's about it. All of those other senses, dealing with chemistry and dealing with light and dealing with where gravity turns out to be, that's all trapped right here, along with pressure and what have you, and heat. So we have most of our senses trapped in one spot, and that is the formation of what we call the central nervous system, or at least the brain. And if I were to track the formation of the brain, looking at organisms that are older evolutionary to newer evolutionary, what we notice, at least in this diagram, is a buildup of one of those segments. And obviously the bigger the organism, the bigger the brain might turn out to be. That's not entirely true. But what we'll see is there's an increase in what we call the forebrain, and a slight increase in part of the hindbrain, but not that much with the midbrain. But even then, parts of it become out of place and warped. So much so that eventually you get this thing. Well, we call the crown jewel of evolution, even though the crown jewel implies it's the best that ever could be, and we ain't done. So who knows how inferior this thing really is, even though we're aware of there's a lot of inferiority with it. So the human brain, or the mammalian brain, turns out to have regions. Without going into uber detail, the bottom section that turns out to be in that purpley brown color, we call that the brainstem, and its job is to keep you alive. That yellowy area, the really super yellowy area, is what we call, it's another portion of the brainstem, but the cerebellum. It turns out to be involved with coordination, and the more coordinated you need to be, the bigger your cerebellum is. That middle section turns out to involve things called the midbrain and your diencephalon. The diencephalon is famous for working with hormones, and it deals with how do we control the massive body without needing to always use neurons. It's a sensory center. The top portion in that cream color is what we call the cerebrum, and the cerebrum is thought and any type of processing of information that requires memory. So the front of the brain is where we think, the back of the brain is where we store visual memories, the sides of the brain are where we deal with sounds and speaking, so communication, and the top turns out to be where we deal with sensations and movements, but conscious, I am choosing to do this type motions. Just recently, because you can see at the top, it's from 2018, start of the year, we are starting to learn that we used to look at all nerve systems with that slide I showed you earlier, and we'd say, oh yeah, so clearly this is the way things work. What we're noticing is, no, it's actually not as easy, because when we start looking at the genes that are involved in how you build a nervous system, the annelids, so like earthworms, we would say, oh yeah, they're kind of like us. And turns out, no, their version of a nervous system is not like our version of a nervous system. Or, oh, the flies, insects have nervous systems like us. And the answer is, no, they don't necessarily do. So what we start to see is there are patterns with evolution that kind of all converge on the same idea. So we call that convergent evolution. We have different ways to get to the same result. And when we have this brain phenomenon, we seem to be noticing that. We have different pathways to get to the same answer. But what about plants? We're learning that plants actually can process information, and far more complexly than we think they do. Meaning, if you touch a plant, it knows you touched it. And if someone else touches it, it can tell the difference between you. It is aware that two different organisms got it. You sit there and you start plucking, bark off of a tree. It knows you're pulling bark off the tree. It doesn't respond the way we do, but there are chemical signals that indicate, yes, it's aware. We can actually track chemical signals that say the plant knows it's under attack because there are attack signals that get sent out. I could show you the Avatar clip, but if you watch the movie Avatar from 2009, they actually flat out show you cell signaling with plants. And obviously, it's now a huge field of inquiry because we're realizing there's a lot more going on than we understand, namely because we're not necessarily all that intelligent. So plants might have been beating us to the intelligence game far longer than we think we have. But how else can we use this? Use these action potentials and process information. So I'm not going to show the video, but this is a video of something called a sundew, which is it's a carnivorous plant, so it actually attacks animals and eats them. The reason why it does so is because it lives in nitrogen-poor soil. Any type of carnivorous plant has nitrogen-poor soil. When you look at this, you're like, oh my gosh, the thing's a monster. The plant's about this big. It's not a really big plant because that's a fly, and flies are that big. So all things kept in moderation. But how else can we use these things? How else does the brain tell us what to do? Well, it could tell us, how to move our muscles. So brains can be used to make spits, they can make hormones, they can have thoughts, or they can make muscles move, at least with us. In plants, we don't know yet. we're still working on that puzzle.